All right, let's get started with our second meeting now. In the first meeting, I told you a long and complicated story that brought together aspects of the history of the cosmos and the earth and of life and humanity, all focused on the Bronze Age in Cyprus. That's one of the kind of things you can do with big history, with the history of everything, is you can pull together these narratives, these stories that deal with lots of different aspects of things that have happened in the past. Some of our friends who are teaching big history elsewhere have started to refer to that kind of a story as a little big history. In other words, it's one set of connections within big history that you can tie together. So that's one of the things we'll be doing. Another thing you can do with big history is to have a chronology, what happened when, in sort of sequential order in any particular regime that you're interested in looking at. A third thing you can do, and that's what we're going to be doing today, is to think about what is the meaning of all of this, or what interesting questions can you ask? For example, hi, come in. This is today. You can ask questions about anything in the past, and in particular about how these different aspects of history tie together. For example, one thing you could ask is, what changes when solid planets appear? Why is the history after solid planets appear, why is that different from the history before that, when there were only gaseous stars and clouds of gas? You can ask questions about, what does all this mean? How does it work together? Almost philosophical level questions. And so that's what I want to do with you today. And our topic today is past, present, and future. Let's think about all of those things, how they tie together. What is the past? What is the present? What is the future? And how do they work together? Today, we don't have a PowerPoint. We have this little handout. This is what my sister calls a mind map. And the idea for a mind map is to have something that is sort of graphically interesting, that will help you remember as you're studying it. So when you go back and you think about this, you may look at this and you might say, oh yes, I remember there was that little pig on the lower right. What's he doing there anyhow? It will help you remember better than simply having an outline. You know, if you have an outline, every outline pretty much looks like every other outline. At this distance, you can't tell that that an outline is any different from any other outline. These I find them much more attractive. So I hope you like mind maps. So some of our lectures will be mind maps. And this is the first one. So let's just go through it. And I would be very grateful if you asked lots of questions. That was starting to happen yesterday in the discussion section. But I think that I could probably run through all of this in a blazing hurry in much less time than we have. So it will be much more interesting if you ask lots of questions and we get a discussion going. Okay? So let's think about past, present, and future, what they are. So to begin with, we might ask the question, why do we study history? Why study it at all? I mean, aren't we living in the present? Who cares about the past? Now, all of you applied for this course, and so you are interested already in history. I don't think I have to do a sales job on you with this, but I think it is interesting to consider what else you might be able to study other than history. And just to be provocative, let me suggest to you that there is nothing else that you can study other than history. And that comes about if we think about, up in this upper left, the future, the present, and the past. Okay, think about the future. The future hasn't happened yet. And what is going to happen, no one can say. Remember, Yesterday in the discussion section, people were talking about the odd little coincidences that brought them into this classroom. Like Ryan said that he wouldn't be here if his friend Courtney hadn't moved to New York, right? And I wouldn't have been here if I had got sent to Indonesia instead of to Libya. So you can't really study the future. There are people called futurists, and what they do is kind of guess what's going to happen. But you can't really study the future. What about the present? Well, we're all living in the present. Okay, what's happening in the present? What's happening in the present now? Well, it's gone. It's the past now, right? It happens so fleetingly that I don't see how you can study the present's gone now. Now there's another, it's gone too, you see. It's happened, the present is this infinitesimal, tiny little fleeting instant in time which is gone the moment you even think about it, right? So what can you study? You can study the past. So in a certain sense, everything we study is history. In geology, we're studying the history of the planet. In paleontology, you're studying the history of life. In human history, in the history department over in Dwanell, you're studying things that happen to human beings. In language departments, you're studying languages which have evolved in the past. Can anybody think of any field on this campus that is not studying the past? Yes. Oh, sure.
Can you say that like mathematics would be like the study of like the nature of kind of present?
I think that's the best candidate. That probably comes closest to being studying something that's not the present, in the sense that presumably the laws of mathematics just are, you know, and they're the same yesterday as they were 100 years ago and as they will be in the future. So in a sense, you're not studying the past, but in another sense, you are. After all, if you do an equation, you know, x equals something or other, and you want to know x, why do you use x? Why don't you use j? Why don't you use apples? Why don't you use apple pie a la mode equals such and other? It is because at some point in the history of the field of mathematics, somebody said, hey, let's use x, and other people found it convenient. So they did it. So in a little bit, in a sense, it's a little, I'm wiggling out of it, right? Obviously. But every field has its own history in which people learned how to do whatever they do in that field, whether it's sociology or Portuguese or mathematics or chemistry or something else, right? So let's say, maybe with some little exceptions or some little quibbles you could make, in a certain sense, the past is all there really is to study. So then let's ask, moving down a little bit, then what is history? What is history, let's say, as a field? So if you talk to history professors, some of them will say to you, history is the study of things that happen in the past that are recorded in written documents. If it's not recorded in a written document, it's not history. Okay? Now that is kind of bothersome to somebody like me who studies things that happened 100 million years ago and are not written down in books, but they're written in rocks. You know, I think, heck, I'm studying history, and most historians I've met are happy with that. Every now and then you get a hardcore person who says, you're not doing history, you're not studying written documents. So I've finally come to the conclusion, what I'll say in a case like that is, okay, let's agree that you are doing history in the strict sense, and I'm doing history in the broad sense. And most of them are happy with that. So history has generally been taken. Most people think most people's definition of history would be this, that it is things written in documents. But we can make a much broader definition, and that's what we'll be doing in this class, which is history is the record of anything that happened in the past. And so it goes much farther back than written documents. And big history is this brand new attempt to tie together all of the things that ever happened in the past, no matter how they're recorded, no matter how they're written down, no matter who studies them, whether it's somebody in the Department of Linguistics or somebody in the Department of Astronomy or somebody in the Department of Molecular Biology. If they're finding out things that happened in the past, they're doing some aspect of big history. So where did this come from? How many of you ever heard of big history before you heard about this class? 1, 2. Okay. All right, that's pretty good. It's growing, you know. Usually it's nobody. So where did this come from? I'll tell you how I started getting interested. I started thinking about all of these different aspects of the past because I've always been widely interested in a whole range of things, and Millie and I have lived all over the world in different interesting cultures and got interested in those. And I started thinking, how could you bring all of this together into a class? And I'd never heard of big history, so I started thinking of it as pan-historia. And I thought that sounded really classy, you know, all of history. And I thought maybe somebody would imagine that I knew some Greek, which of course I don't, but I thought it was a great name. And then I went on the web one time and I looked it up, and turns out, anybody know Pan-Historia? It is a massive online computer game that people link into and they play, and it's called Pan-Historia because it mixes everything up. As I understand it, in Pan-Historia, you can be Napoleon fighting against Genghis Khan in Tierra del Fuego, for example. And I thought, well, I just got to get another name. And right about that point, I heard of this man whose picture is here, David Christian. And David is a historian of Russia, Russian historian. He trained in Oxford. He's lives in Australia, and he had the same sort of interest that I do, very broad. And one time, he told this story about how it got started. One time, they were having a faculty meeting at Macquarie University in Sydney, in Australia, which is where David taught. And one of the things that you do in faculty meetings sometimes is you talk about what courses should be in our curriculum. And so in this particular faculty meeting, the different professors were talking about how far back in time should their history courses at that university start. So that the classicists said, well, you start with Greece and Rome, of course. You know? But there were some Middle Eastern people, and they said, well, then you're leaving out the history of Egypt and the history of Babylonia and the history of Assyria. Got to start further back. And then somebody else said, yeah, but things were happening before that. Don't you think we should go back to the agricultural revolution? And at that point, David, who was quite young at the time, sort of timidly held up his hand and he said, well, if you follow that line of reasoning, I don't see any point that we should start our history curriculum more recently than the Big Bang. This is in a humanities department. There's dead silence, you know. Finally, somebody says, with just a hint of sarcasm, well, you want to teach that? And David swallowed hard and he said, yes, I think I do. And that's how it got started. And he came up with the name Big History. And the way he started, being a humanist and not having much background in science, he organized a course and he would get people from the different science departments to come in and give guest lectures. And over the years he got so he knew, he'd heard those lectures a lot, and he got so that he could talk about them. We all consider David to be the founder of Big History. So when I heard about that, it was just perfect. I thought, I want to do that. And down in the lower left-hand corner, you can see some of the places that I've worked around the globe. So you can see the reason why I've gotten interested in human history as well as Earth history. Yes, Alexis?
Yes. I was just wondering if you knew when David Christian did about.
When did he do that? I think it was probably about 20 years ago, something like that. And so for a long time, it was just him. And you can sort of imagine this. Most people in academia are not interested in this sort of approach because most people in academia are specialists. I mean, specialization works. It's how we've learned enormous amounts about all kinds of things. Now, if you want to make an advance in geology, you better spend years and years and years learning to be a really good geologist so that you can kind of get to the point where you can make a contribution. So not many people do have this broad approach. And only gradually other people became aware of what David was doing. And the first one, so we sort of think of him as David's first disciple, is Fred Spear. We're now at the top of the right-hand column here. Fred Spear is a sociologist in Holland who has a background in, I believe, chemistry. So he has a scientific background, which David doesn't. But Fred actually wrote the first book about big history. It's a little short book called The Structure of Big History. And he basically says he's going to try to think about these things that David Christen had tied together. And maybe the most important thing in that book is a concept of regimes. And so here's the first thing for you to learn and really get in your head today is a concept of a regime, because we'll use that all the way through this course. So Fred was thinking, if you're dealing with something as vast as all of history, how do you make manageable chunks out of it that you can understand? And so he came up with this concept of regimes. And if you ask for a definition of regime, it will be hard to give, because this word, as he uses it, is vague. I would say it's usefully vague, because we don't have full definitions of things yet. This field is so new that there are not yet there's not established textbooks that you can go and read. Well, a definition is such and such and such. We're making it up as we go along. And I think that might be something that would be really fun for you guys, is to be in on that. I mean, if you get inspired by this, heck, nobody's done very much yet on big history. You might make a contribution to it even while you're in this class. Okay, so what did he mean by regimes? He used it in 2 or 3 different ways. So first of all, he uses it to mean a time interval in history. So you could think of the Earth history regime. That would be all of the history that's happened since the Earth formed up until now. Or you could think of it as, you could make it, for example, as the Stone Age, the time when people were making their tools out of stone, right? And used in this way, here's the first very useful distinction that I've found helpful, and you will sort of pick this up it's almost like a mantra that you will pick up very quickly. So I think of big history as divided into 4 regimes: cosmic history, Earth history, life history, and human history. So you might remember that was the subtitle of this course. It's Big History, and the subtitle is Cosmos, Earth, Life, and Humanity. Sometimes I find it useful to put in 2 others. Sometimes I think it's useful to treat the Big Bang as its own separate regime, the very beginning of everything. And sometimes it's useful to divide out human prehistory, because that deals with us humans, but before there was any written history. But anyhow, 4 or 6 major regimes seems like a really good way to start out your own personal demarcation of events in the past. You'll hear lots more about this as we go on. Fred also sometimes uses it as what he calls a time-space portion of history. So I don't know if anybody picked up when I said Stone Age being a time interval. Somebody could have raised their hand and said, yeah, but there are Stone Age people in the 19th century in Papua New Guinea, whereas the Stone Age had long since ended in Europe. So it's oftentimes helpful to take a period of time in a certain area and consider that to be a regime. So in this case, medieval Christianity could be a regime, and maybe medieval Islam would be a different regime going on at the same time, but with very different things happening, right? And then he uses it in a third way, which I frankly have found less useful, but it's interesting to think about, and that is the entities that each of us has to deal with in our lives. So, for example, he talks about the personal regime. That's how you deal with yourself. How do you treat yourself? What do you do with the mind and body that you've been given? What kind of a person are you going to be? What is your are you going to put a big emphasis on integrity, or are you going to put a big emphasis on getting ahead at all costs? What kind of person are you going to be? So that's dealing with the personal regime. That's just you, right? And then a second one would be the social regime, which is how you deal with all the other people that you encounter in your life. And then finally, he speaks of the ecological regime, which would be how we deal with the natural world. Questions at this point? Comments? Thoughts? Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, when I look at this, I kind of see how everything is interconnected. And so I think pretty much all fields of history can somehow find its place within these four regimes.
Mm-hmm. So that everything can find its place within these four regimes. Yeah, that's the idea. And I suppose it would be also fair enough to say, well, here we're trying to do big history and bring everything together, and then I'm immediately dividing it up into these sub-regimes. Isn't that just what people normally do? There's the geology department and the paleontology department. And I think you almost have to be able to put some sort of mental boundaries in it to say, now I'm dealing with one thing, now I'm dealing with another. And even though everything will fit into it, one thing that impresses me more and more as I think about big history is what happens when you change from one regime to another. For example, think about when life first appears on this planet. Absolutely fundamental changes take place. I mean, we all think about what is life, and you think, well, life is you think about metabolism, and you think about birth and death and reproduction and mobility and things like that. But one of the things that really impresses me about what happened when life first appeared, think about cells. Each cell has got a membrane around it that isolates it from the rest of everything else. I mean, we have our skin that separates us, but each cell has its own bounding membrane, and that appeared when life appeared. I've tried and tried and tried to think of an example, a similar example in the way the Earth works. And it's very hard to find a boundary that separates one individual from another individual. I mean, you may have the warm tropical seas and the cold polar seas, but it's a complete gradation in between. So that's why I think that it's really important to make these distinctions between regimes, because the change from one to the other may be marked by some really fundamental, phenomenal change that took place. Just one other, for example, what happens when you have the Earth? Well, if you think about a pre-Earth cosmos, it's made up of hydrogen, helium, not much else. Gases and plasmas. Plasmas are gases that are so hot that the electrons have come loose from the atoms, right? So that's what most of the cosmos is. When you get the Earth, you got something new. You've got solids and liquids. There aren't any solids, there aren't any liquids on the sun or anywhere else. And so that's why I think it's really important to recognize these different regimes. Okay? Thank you. Another question? Okay, think up some more. All right, so let's go to this. Oh, yes, Deborah? Oh, am I missing one? Yeah. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, Alex?
All right. Well, from my understanding, this is more a focus on the connection between different, everything you said is history. So this class focuses on connecting them. And so, now you're talking about how it, you have to split them and kind of categorize them, but it's still a focus on the relation. Like we're always when we talk about cosmos, we're always going to see that there's a relation between the other regimes, and that's so. Would you say that that's still the focus of the course? Is big history is connection between all history?
Yeah, I think it is. It's a focus on how everything ties together. But when you separate out and think about this regime versus that regime, maybe you're looking at more profound changes, like the appearance of solids and liquids, instead of doing it like we do in the university and saying, Earth, oh, McCone Hall, Geology Department, or Life, LSB, LSA, right? And this notion that cells are bounded and separate and they go their own way and they do their own chemistry inside, I think that's a more profound concept than just saying, well, chemistry department, that's over in Hildebrand Hall, right? Okay, there's another, yes, Wes. Yeah, Wes.
Would you say that the set of regimes that you recognize depends on whatever specific question you're dealing with? It's not that there's just a strict set of regimes. It's if you ask, like, when did life first appear, then that's going to make it necessary to break time periods up into regimes, but only based on that particular.
Yeah, so do you need different sets of regimes when you're dealing with different kinds of questions? I think absolutely so. For example, in geology, we divide things by time. For example, there's the Cretaceous period that Ryan mentioned yesterday, the one where this chalk lived. But what happened in the Cretaceous in England, which is where there's chalk, was completely different from what happened in the Cretaceous here in California when there was volcanism and granites in place. So I guess it's a way of helping you organize and structure a particular problem that you get interested in. So when you do your research reports, it might be a really useful exercise to think early on about, does the concept of regimes help me any in organizing my ideas about this? Yes. Deborah, you had one.
So I'm trying to understand the idea of history, and keeping in mind your presentation at your last lecture, I'm sort of getting the sense that we're learning to see the world with a kind of zoom lens, and that whatever regime we're looking at, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we're trying to look at it both on the personal, the timeline, and all these different ways, zooming in and out, just to broaden our perspective in the way that we're looking at everything all the time. Is that what you...
Yeah, I really like your use of the word zoom on that. That this is an opportunity for you to develop a perspective on everything that's happened in the past that you might be interested in. And curiously enough, next week we will be showing you chronozoom, which was what Roland invented while he was in this class a couple of years ago. And it's exactly that. It's a way of zooming in and out and seeing things in more detail, more specialized, or going way back out and seeing how they all fit together, which is what gets left out of so many treatments of the past. So, good. All right. I just wanted to try out something here almost for fun in this lower right. There's another goal that I have for you in this class, and this is subversive. I don't want you to tell anybody in any other department about this. Don't tell any other professor about this. But what I would like you to do is to realize that you can take charge of your own education. You know, here you are at a university that says you have to have a major, right? And you have to have so many units in this major, and you have to have these breadth requirements, and you have to have this residence time and all this sort of stuff. And that's because we professors have been thinking about this for a long time, longer than you have, and this works. This is a good way to have people acquire an education. And so take advantage of all of this wonderful wisdom that we have that we're imparting, but at the same time, you can think about, what do I want my own education to be? I can do everything they say I need to do, but I can also be thinking on my own about how to learn what I want to learn. And so I thought here it would be interesting for a moment just to think about different phases in your education. So the first part would be you just got to know a bunch of stuff. So one of the things that you're doing in this university is just learning a lot of things. You're acquiring a lot of knowledge that you need, right? And hopefully as you increase your knowledge, then you come to the second part, which is understanding. You understand why these things are the way they are. Whatever knowledge you're acquiring, how did it come to be? That's the history part of it. And then finally, the part that we don't do very well in universities, I think, is to help you think about judgment, which is going to be really important to you in your lives, what kind of decisions you're going to make and how you deal with your own self, your personal regime, and how you deal with other people in the social regime. So I just wanted to try just a little experiment for fun now to think about these different sides, and I want to try out, and I want to get you to help me to list here some knowledge that we all have. Okay, so over here, I'm going to have one list, and it's going to be what something is called when it's in the field, and the other over here is what it's going to be called when it's on the table. All right? So, our little guy who's sitting there in the field, he's called a pig, right? On the table, he's called pork, right? Okay? And there's a whole bunch of those in the English language where there's different names for something when it's on the table or when it's in the field. So what I want you to do now, we'll take 2 or 3 minutes, is get together, bunch up with the people on your table. This is your first table exercise. And write down a list of those, and we'll have a bunch of them. And those of you in the back, you are little tables too, okay? So think up some more examples. You're part of this table.
Oh, yeah.
Are you getting some? Getting some?
Is it all of us?
Oh yeah, all of you. Pull together. Pull together.
Well, I guess for the morbid one, there's a person.
I bet you can't hear her down there. Scrunch up. I want you to get unified here. Okay, let's see what you got. Let's see what examples people came up with. So, can I get somebody to suggest another example? What's a field name? Tree. Okay, I hadn't thought about that. Pencil. Okay, I'm sorry. I should have been on the. I meant the table where you're eating. Excuse me. I didn't mean the table where I should have said. Okay, napkin. All right. Think about it with animals. Cow. Okay, let's take this one off because I was just not very clear about that. Okay, cow. And what's on the table? Beef. Okay. What's another one? What? Wheat. Oh, that's interesting. Try.
Fish and sushi.
Okay. Try to stick with meat of various kinds. So that's what? Fish and sushi. That's interesting. Any more?
Venison instead of deer.
Deer and venison. That's a good one.
Chicken and poultry.
Chicken and poultry. Any more?
How about wildflowers and bouquets?
Okay, I'm trying to stick. I should have said this. I'm trying to stick in meat of different kind. Okay. What? Sheep and mutton. Okay. Okay, that's enough for now. How many of you seen this sort of dichotomy of things before? Okay. So why is this? Why do we have this? So in other words, this is knowledge. You all know these names. You've known these since you were children. So now, when we come to the question of understanding, why do we have these things? Why don't we call it cow when it's on the table? Or why don't we call it mutton when it's walking around in the field? Yeah.
I think they're euphemisms. Words that we use so we don't have to think about, the slaughtering process.
That's very interesting. That might be. I think it has that effect. That's not where it came from. It came from another reason. Yeah. Danielle?
In my English 45A class, the way the professor explained it is that English borrows words from lots of different languages depending on who was conquering which part of England at which time. So we've been calling cows for a long time, but when the French come in and take over and they have a word that's similar to something like beef.
Yeah.
So these words all get incorporated into the language over time.
Exactly. Isn't that the right word? The right spelling? Okay. It comes from French. Yeah. Peter?
Well, how about when it's on the table, it's not really a cow anymore. There's a process that it goes through, and the end result is.
That's true. But on the other hand, it's that's perfectly good. That's perfectly good. But Danielle is on to the point that I really wanted to make here. Yeah, Deborah, you can say something?
Well, I noticed just from my studies that when things are renamed from another name, it's sort of personalized. So it's a process of renaming, it's claiming.
Well, in this particular case, if you look at these, and if we take out the ones here, let me take out this one because this is a plant rather than an animal. And we now have one thing here that has a Japanese name. But the fact is that all of these words come from French. English is a real borrowing language. We borrow words from every place. And all of these words for meat on the table comes from French. Now, why do you suppose that is? When did this happen? Think historically now. This is maybe the first example of what Ryan referred to yesterday that I like to call historical mindedness. If you are thinking about what happened in the past that produced a situation you see today, like it's chicken on the farm and it's poultry on the table. What lay behind that? Yes, Natalie?
Well, because it wasn't our language of the elites French.
Yes, that's exactly it. The language of the elite was French in England. And so, and when was this? What? Yeah, here's a number. This is a date that you probably all know. 1066. Okay, 1066 was the invasion of England by the Norman French. French-speaking people, actually of Scandinavian origin mostly, but they were French speakers and they took over the place. They ruled it, right? So for 200 or 300 years after 1066, the elite spoke French, and the common people, the peasants and the working people, spoke English or Middle English or something like that, right? Early English. And so there was actually a time then when the king of England couldn't understand his subjects because they spoke English and he spoke French. But just imagine now, these animals, when they're out in the field, they're getting taken care of by peasants. the peasants are calling them by their English name, and then it gets taken in the kitchen, and it gets turned into something, an elegant dish, which is set in front of the Lord, and for him it's not cow, it's bœuf, right? So here is a piece of understanding that comes from history, that these words, the way we use them, are a direct result of the invasion in 1066. You might then wonder, and here's a little bit harder to make this connection to judgment and personal regime and social regime, but maybe we might think about how our language works and how some other languages work. So for example, English borrows stuff all the time. I mean, we borrow words from every language we come in contact with, and we make up new words, and we change words all the time. It's kind of like it's the mores, the ethics of the English language, is that we're not fussy about who we steal words from, right? There are other languages, for example, Spanish is a good example. Spanish doesn't do that very much. Spanish is very fussy about keeping the language as pure and as Spanish as it can possibly be. So to the extent where there is a Royal Academy in Madrid, and every Latin American country, I believe, has its own language academy, and these academies kind of work together. They're all linked up with the one in Madrid, and they decide what is going to be in Spanish and what is not. So if you've studied Spanish, you know that in Spanish, if you read a word, you know how to pronounce it. There just aren't any exceptions, or very, very few exceptions. That's one of the things that makes Spanish such a joy to learn. If you're a Spaniard trying to learn English, how on earth do you pronounce these things that are written in these weird ways? And why are they written in these weird ways? Because we've gotten them from all kinds of other different languages and sort of kept the spelling. So anyway, not to make too big a point out of this, but the idea I wanted to bring across here was to think about knowledge in your education, and then wherever you can, to think about understanding. What does that knowledge come from? What lies behind it? And this is where historical mindedness is, in my mind, the key. If you're never going to understand that unless you think about 1066. And then wherever you can see an application for it, think about how that applies into developing your own judgment, your own personal and social relationships. Okay, what I'd like to do now is take another one of these tiny, tiny little intermissions. Don't even talk to anybody. Just kind of sit there and let's get recentered, and then we'll go on. Okay, we all back in the groove? Good. So on the second page, now let's think about past, present, and future. That's what we're going to do for the rest of this time. And let's just think about those three and the past. And just for fun, I set out some pictures here because I'd like you to think about the Berkeley campus. So every one of you walked across the Berkeley campus to get to this building today. I don't think anyone was delivered in a limousine, so you probably all walked. Let's think about what this place was like in the past. We know what it's like today. Well, the sun is shining, certain buildings are here, students are here, professors of different kinds, research laboratories, libraries, all those things. They're all here now. Let's think about what it was like in the past. Okay, in the upper left, if you were to go back 10 million years ago, and that sounds like a lot to you now, maybe, but once you become acquainted with geology, you'll realize that 10 million years is not very many million years ago. There's a volcano here. How do you suppose we know that? Yeah.
Because of the fault lines.
There are fault lines here, but you can also have fault lines where there aren't any volcanoes. So that's part of it. That's probably why the volcano was where it was. But how do we even know there was a volcano here, Matt?
The bedrock is igneous.
Absolutely. So how many of you have driven through the Caldecott Tunnel and on out to Orinda? Okay, if you're going toward Orinda, you come out of the Caldecott Tunnel, there's a big road cut on your left and a road cut on your right. That's full of volcanic rocks. And in fact, as you go through that, I don't want to distract you and get you in danger on the road, but just the second half of that road cut on your right is a real dark gray rock. Those are volcanic rocks. They were erupted about 10 million years ago. We can date them by radiometric dating techniques. And they poured out of a volcano. Any of you ever been to Sibley Volcanic Park, which is up on, okay, we got an occasional geologist here. Right, so that's where the volcano actually was, and the volcanic rock came pouring down into what is now Highway 24. So the Berkeley campus was a volcanic landscape. Just so that you don't think I'm cheating, that obviously is not a picture of the Berkeley volcano, but that's Mount Lassen when it erupted in early part of the 1900s. Okay, so 10 million years ago, the Berkeley campus was not like what it is now. So what about a few centuries ago, before the Europeans came? Well, the local Native American people here were called the Olones. And I don't know whether they would have ever had a village here, because the Olones were primarily living on shellfish from the bay. Any of you been down to Emeryville and run into Shell Mound Avenue? Okay, Shell Mound Avenue is called that because in the early part of the 20th century, in the 19th century, there was a great mound of oyster shells there. And that was just the refuse from Ohlone people who were living in villages on the shore of the bay. I would imagine they probably came up here onto the Berkeley campus from time to time and collected acorns and things like that. Okay, now try to put yourself for a moment in the mind of one of those people. Okay, it's a nice day, you've decided that you can't stand any more oysters, that you want some nice acorns. And so you come up to this place along what later would be called Strawberry Creek, and there's this nice sort of hillside, and there's oak trees, and you collect some acorns and take them home. Are you in the mindset of that person right now? Try to imagine what that person would have thought if they could have known that in 200 years there would be a world-class research university here. No way. Impossible to imagine that. Just as I think it's impossible for us to imagine what might be here 200 or 500 years in the future from now. Okay. So then, when the campus was first being built, the middle picture on the left, that shows North and South Halls. Before the Campanile was even built, some of you, I think, know South Hall, which is the one on the right. How many of you seen the smallest bear on the Berkeley campus? Roland showed that to me recently. Okay, I'd never seen that before. The geology department used to be in that many, many years ago. But look at that. There are 2 Victorian buildings on the campus there in 1910 or something like that, because it was before they decided to make Berkeley have neoclassical architecture like the Campanile and Doe Library and so many of the other great buildings. That's the way it was. This is the Berkeley campus in the past. That's what we're looking at. Okay, look at the one on the right. Any of you heard about the play in 1982? Oh yeah, I bet you have. Millie and I were at that game, and we made the mistake of going with a couple who were really good friends who both graduated from Stanford. And it took about a decade for the friendship to recover from that experience. But at any rate, that happened in the past. That past is within living memory of at least some people. Okay, so all these things have happened on the Berkeley campus in the past. All right, what about the present? Okay. As I was pointing out a moment ago, the present is there and it's gone, and then there's a new present. So I just love this picture of the sousaphones and the Cal band out there doing their run-along thing, and if you'll notice, none of those feet are touching the ground. So that was an instant. That was the present for about as long as the camera shutter was open, which was maybe 100th of a second. And then they all came down on whatever foot was coming down, and that present was part of the past, and it's been part of the past ever since. So the present is so slippery, you just can't get your hands on it. You think you got it, and it's gone. So that's the nature of the present. All right, what about the future? So just as the Olones out here collecting acorns just couldn't possibly have imagined this area as a university campus, which was a concept which was completely unknown to them, it's pretty hard for us to imagine what the Berkeley campus might be in the future. You got a pretty good idea what's going to be for the rest of this semester. You know, there'll be graduation in May and things like that. But what about 100 years from now? What about 500 years from now? What about 10,000 years from now? What about 50 million years from now? What will be here? So just for the fun of it, I put some possibilities down here for what the Berkeley campus might be, and then after we go through these, maybe you'll have be thinking up some thoughts for what the Berkeley campus might be. So here's someone, Roland, I think particularly liked this one 2 years ago. Imagine that this might be an intergalactic spaceport. I mean, not just a galactic spaceport, but an intergalactic spaceport. I don't know when. I don't know whether it will ever be possible to go to other galaxies, but maybe that's what Berkeley campus will be. That's pretty hard to imagine, isn't it? On the other hand, maybe after the 30th great earthquake had knocked the Berkeley campus down, they just said, this just isn't a good place to have a university or anything, and they just walked away and it turned it into a park with oak trees and acorns, right? Maybe that's what it'll be. Or, on the other hand, maybe by the time some of you are professors, they will have decided that little independent universities like this aren't a good idea, and in fact, there will be the great Berkeley, Stanford, Davis, Santa Cruz mega university, and this will be one hub in it, you know? And that you get from here to the Santa Cruz hub by hyper underground, ultra fast, you know, rail in vac, or maybe you get teleported like Captain Kirk or somebody like that. Anybody got some ideas as we go on? What else might the Berkeley campus be? Yeah, Yuli.
Underwater.
Underwater. Sure, you go far enough in the future, it's almost sure to be underwater because geology does that. You know, things go up, things go down. Not in our lifetimes, hopefully, but sure, that could be. Maybe it will be forgotten ruins in an unexcavated archaeological preserve. Maybe people 1,000 years from now will say, you know, there was some pretty interesting things happening 1,000 years ago. We had to set aside some areas where there were things. Someday we'll get around to excavating them archaeologically. Maybe that's what Berkeley will be. You got another idea? What else might it be? Maybe aliens will occupy it. Absolutely. And maybe they will have gotten rid of us, or maybe they will have intermarried with us, or maybe we will have done ourselves in and they'll come in and say, well, this is a nice place. That could be. That could be. Or maybe we will continue to have a growing population and grow and grow and grow to the point where the entire Earth is covered by a 100-story high global city. And this will just be one neighborhood in it. You know, maybe that's it. Or maybe all of these at different times, right? Or maybe it'll be a radioactive ruin after a nuclear war. Isn't that a charming thought? Or even worse, much farther in the future, when the sun is maybe a couple of times older than it is already, 2 or 3 times older, the sun will expand and become a red giant and swallow up the Earth's orbit, and we'll just be the Berkeley campus will be a cinder left there. Or maybe we humans are on the way out and computers are on the way in. and that after another 100 years or so, or maybe another 5 years, maybe the computers will decide that we're dispensable, that the Earth would be better off if only computers lived here. So maybe Berkeley will be the capital city of post-human civilization. Or how about this? Maybe at some time in the future, when they're no longer doing scholarship and science, maybe this will be a museum, remembering what great scholarship and what great science were. They won't be doing it because they'll have Alvoism, and they won't need science or scholarship. Thank you for asking. What is Alvoism? I haven't the foggiest notion because it hasn't been invented yet. But maybe that's what they'll call whatever replaces science and scholarship.
Putting a chip in there with information,
Something like that, yeah. Or maybe they'll, I don't know, maybe they'll be reading the Galactica, the Encyclopedia Galactica that's coming in by radio waves, and they won't need professors anymore because you just get it off of the... So the point here is, think about these things. The past, any particular place has been all kinds of things in the past, just like the Berkeley campus. The present is so fleeting that you can't get a hold on it. And the future is undetermined. It could be any or all, maybe not all. It could be any of those things or any other that you think of. Who's got one more to add? Anybody got one? Yes, right. Pardon? A trash dump. Maybe so. Maybe that will be what happens when, maybe it'll even be a fossil trash dump because people will have just ruined the planet and there'll be nothing left but trash, and this will be one of the places. So that's as cheery as some of my scenarios, isn't it? Okay. Right. So can we turn over to the next page? And let me show you our very first time scale. This would be a really good one for you to memorize. I've got some helpful hints for you there. But this one is divided into the 4 regimes: cosmic history, Earth history, life history, and human history. Now, piece of technical advice for you. Whenever you look at a timeline, the first thing to do is to look and see which way time runs. Because it can run left to right, right to left, top to bottom, or bottom to top. So in this particular case, this one is laid out so that old is at the bottom and young is at the top. And that's natural for me because geologists do that and archaeologists do that because we find our history in layers, piles of sediment or piles of ruins that have accumulated one on top of each other. So for geologists and archaeologists, paleontologists, it's natural to put old at the bottom, young at the top. If you read a human history book, it will almost always be the other way, with old at the top and young at the bottom. And then you'll also find timelines that run from left to right and from right to left. So in this particular case, just look at it for a moment. This runs from 13.7 billion years ago to the present. And so cosmic history, our first regime then, starts 13.7 billion years ago and runs up to the present time. Okay? Starting with the Big Bang at about 13.7 billion years ago. If you want, you might want to call that 13.5. That's an easier one to remember. Yeah, right.
I noticed that we started with the Big Bang, and obviously that's like the beginning of what we know happened. But there's been other like theoretical physicists that have talked about other universes existing before and also at the same time as ours. And I think there was recently some kind of microwave image that showed some ripple effects throughout the universe that had, laid some evidence towards those theories. So as that kind of gets incorporated in, would there be the possibility of big history going back before there was actually time? Because, I mean, wasn't time created in the Big Bang?
That's a really profound and important question. What was before the Big Bang? What, if anything, was before the Big Bang? Until recently, when you talk to cosmologists and physicists, they would tell you there wasn't anything before the Big Bang. That's when time and space, or let's say space-time, were created at the Big Bang. So it's meaningless to ask what happened before that, because that's when time started and everything started. But what Matt is pointing out is that concept is currently being rethought. And there are cosmologists, and we'll talk about this probably next week, I think, who are suggesting that maybe our universe is only one of a vast, vast number of universes, all of which are different, and which maybe they bud from one into another. And I don't follow this extremely closely, but it is very much a hot topic in cosmology right now. And you will come across it when you read, as I'm sure you've done, Matt, and when you read popular science discussions of cosmology. So it's a really important question. But it's also entirely hypothetical whether there was anything before the Big Bang. So from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to begin our big history at 13.7 billion years, keeping in mind that it might be a bigger story than that. Okay, good. All right. So if you look up above, you'll see that Earth history begins at about 4.5 billion years ago. Now let me show you something that's really a remarkable coincidence. I don't think this is at all significant, but if you look at the beginning of the Earth, it's 4.5 GA. GA stands for billion years ago. It's giga annum. It's the same root as in gigabyte, means billion bytes, right? And interestingly enough, if you multiply that times 3, the answer you get is 13.5 GA. So if you want to memorize the simple dates, 4.5 times 3 is 13.5. Isn't that neat? That helps you remember. Now here's something that I happened across last year. I had no idea, but if you take the very best age that we have for the Earth, which is 4.567 GA, and that's about plus or minus 1, so we really know that date well. 4, 5, 6, 7, that's pretty easy to remember, huh? So if you remember 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you multiply that times 3, the answer is 13.7, which is the best value we have for the age of the cosmos right now. It's a curious coincidence that the Earth is exactly 1/3 the age of the cosmos using the best numbers that are available right now. I don't think it means anything. It's a neat coincidence, isn't it? Okay. So then, life history, we really don't know very well when it began. So I put that slanting line across the bottom to show that it probably began somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago. So the best number in here is the age of the Earth. That's 4, 5, 6, 7 million years ago, plus or minus 1, or maybe plus or minus 2. The other dates are all much less certain than that. And then over there in the upper right is human history. Can you see that? I think it printed, didn't it? And when that began kind of depends on how you define it. So you might define it as beginning 1 million years ago, or 100,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. It just really depends on how you choose to define the beginning of human history. But in any case, the line is so thin that you can't see it. So I grotesquely exaggerated the thickness of that line so that you could even see it at all, right? So let's just think about that for a second. Most people, when they see this diagram, they look at that and they say, oh my gosh, we're utterly insignificant, right? I don't think so. In terms of time, yes. We're tiny, brief little instant out of all of the time that has been, we humans. But when you start thinking about all that has happened since human beings have come around, the time may be brief, but the significance, the achievements, the changes, the enormous complexity that has arisen because of what we can do with our minds and our hands is just enormous. So I don't look at this and say, oh, human history is insignificant, we ought to close down the history department. That would be ridiculous. What it looks like to me is that it took a long time to get to where some creatures like us could appear who were able to make changes so fast that this regime is utterly unlike any other regime. The human regime is utterly unlike any other. Okay? So do try to get this one into your mind. Okay, let's turn over to the last thing. I want to just think in maybe a slightly more philosophical way about past, present, and future to finish off this lecture. So here is a diagram, and the diagram shows on the right, it's showing the future. So this is something where the diagram runs from old on the left to young on the right, because the future is stuff that hasn't even happened yet. But I tried to draw all these swirling contingencies, and the sweeping lines are continuities. That means things that kind of go continuing, like the rise and fall of civilizations. And then there are all those little events in there, and question marks and swirls. Those are events that happened, like the birth of you, each one of you, right? Which was unpredictable, and which might have enormous effects on history depending on what you do. And I have this quotation there from John Lewis Gaddis, who wrote the book that we're reading right at the beginning of the course. So here's what he says. I prefer to think of the present as a singularity through which the future has got to pass in order to become the past. The present achieves this transformation by locking into place relationships between continuities and contingencies. On the future side of the singularity, these are fluid, decoupled, and therefore indeterminate. However, as they pass through the singularity, they fuse and cannot then be separated. I think that's really a profoundly important statement of what present, past, and future are. So the present, this fleeting instant that we can't quite grab a hold of, is the singularity in which the undetermined future becomes the past as it was. So think of it as singularity, or Millie likes to call that the donut hole. We're passing through the donut hole every instant of our life, and what is done and can't be undone. Sadly, life does, maybe some of you have had this reaction occasionally when you've done something you wish you hadn't. Sadly, life has no undo button. Darn it, absolutely. Okay, so think about that. And then here's a concept in the middle left. How far away is the past? I started thinking about this a few years ago. One of my good friends on campus is Rich Muller. Have any of you had physics for future presidents? Okay, so you know Rich. So I said to Rich one time, thinking about the question, how far away is the past? I mean, in a sense, certain way it doesn't make any sense, because the past is time and far away is space. But I had started thinking about the speed of light. Okay, the speed of light is 180,000 miles per second, or it's 300,000 kilometers per second. And that number is just absolutely fundamental. It is built into the framework of the way the cosmos works sometimes. Think about, if you completely annihilate matter, you get the energy that you get out is equal to the mass that goes in times c squared, and that's simply a constant. It says that, it says that mass and energy are somehow equivalent, and the proportionality between them is the speed of light squared. It doesn't have anything to do with how fast it goes. It's just a number which is fundamental to the way the universe works. So in a certain way, then we could say if c equals 186,000 miles per second, we could turn that around and we could say, well, this is somehow a constant, so we could say that 1 second is somehow about the same as 186,000 miles. In the way that the universe thinks about things and works, somehow a second is equivalent to 186,000 miles. So I said to Rich, would it be right to say that something that happened 1 second ago is as distant from us as a planet that's 186,000 miles away? And he thought about it for a while and said, yeah, I think you can think of it that way. You know, it may not be, it may not help you do anything, but it may help you visualize the passage of time. And to me, this was a powerful and sort of horrifying notion that something that happened a second ago, that click, okay, is as far away as something that's that many light seconds away. So if you look at that here, look at the Earth, for the distance to the sun, from here to the sun is 8 light minutes. So something that happened 8 light minutes ago, which was while we were talking about this time scale, that instant was as far away as the sun is now from us. Or, look at these, I'm over on the right-hand side now. Jupiter is 43 light minutes away, so the halfway through this class ago has receded from us as far as Jupiter is away. And this is maybe a way of getting you to think about how profound a concept time is, or how profound an aspect of the world that we live in. That these things that just happened are utterly beyond reach and going farther and farther all the time. Yeah, Natalie? Where do they go? Well, you know, that's where it becomes more of a metaphor, because I don't think they go anywhere. They just become distant from us.
So it's so distant that you can't change it.
It's so it's sort of maybe a way of, maybe a lesson to draw from it is just what she said. You can't change it. That things that happened in the past are so far away. Maybe that's why we can't change them. Maybe if they were just crawling away, we could reach out and grab it and have an undo button. But I don't know. I find it shocking to think about time in that way. And yet that is the world that we live in. That is the universe that we live in. So maybe it will give you a thought about time that you haven't had before. So the bottom line in the lower part of this page then, the whole point of what we've been talking about today is that the future is indeterminate. It's unknowable until it happens. We don't know which, if any, of those scenarios will ever come to pass. The main thing you can say about the future is that you can't predict it. All right? The present is fleeting, slippery, and it's gone so fast that it's just almost unrecognizable. And then finally, the past is almost frighteningly distant. But even though it's gone and it's so far away, the cool thing is that we have learned how to read the records of the past. We can find out what happened before the Dark Age that followed the extinction of the Bronze Age civilization. We can do it with archaeology. We can find out about volcanoes in the Berkeley Hills because we know how to read the volcanic rocks that are out there. We can even find out about the Big Bang by looking at light that was emitted at the very beginning of time. So we can then, in a certain case, recover. We can't go back to it, but we can recover and understand a lot about what did happen in the past, in all of the past. And that's what this class is about. So have a good weekend and see you next week.